Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail. Today, we will share real Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story, the Wendigo. I am writing everything down in this journal to document our journey to Fort Kent and the subsequent events that transpired afterward. I hope that whoever finds this journal will publicize what had happened in this town to us between the dates of January 12th to February 13th, 2018. Do you know of the Fort Kent Wendigo in Alberta, Canada? Most would say it is an urban legend, but after what I have read and experienced, my view has taken 180-degree turn. It all started when myself and a group of 3 friends wanted to make a Bollywood movie about the Wendigo. After spending 2 weeks of researching the Wendigo and what they look like, I found the Wendigo of Fort Kent. Some say that a doctor locked himself in his house with his dead wife that had just died of smallpox. Then he ate her and turned into the Wendigo. Along with his wife, many of the townsfolk died from smallpox. Once the man left his home, he killed and ate the remaining dozen or so residents of the town. No one is really sure about what happened, but there is one fact no one can deny. Fort Kent became a ghost town, and no one really knows why. After finding out all of this information, I knew that we had a great idea for a movie. The only problem was the place was pretty isolated, so if we got into any trouble, it would be days before anyone would be able to help them. Luckily, Bobby's parents were filthy rich, since they were both plastic surgeons. They spoiled Bobby rotten and gave him everything he wanted. Even so, he was a pretty down-to-earth guy and one of my best friends. Along with Bobby, there was Mike and Kylie. As for myself, the producer of the soon-to-be movie, my name is Tara. So we took off in a small jet, heading from Ottawa, Ontario, Canada to Elk Point Airport, Alberta. We took a fancy Canon 80D DSLR camera with us to shoot the movie, as well as a portable field mixer, a wireless microphone system, a shotgun microphone and boom pole, wind protection for the mics, a field recorder, and headphones. Along with all of that equipment, we brought camping equipment. When we got to Elk Point Airport, we rented a Hyundai Tucson, loaded it up with all of our equipment, and headed for Bonnyville. Now it usually takes 45 minutes to an hour to drive to Bonnyville, but we were going in January. They had just gotten 24 cms of snow, and the roads were heavy with snow. It took us 3 hours to get to Bonnyville, where we got groceries and lots of alcohol for our month stay in the ghost town of Fort Kent. For a bit of background, the 4 of us have been friends since elementary and just graduated high school. We decided to take a year off before heading to college and came up with the bright idea of making a horror movie. Bobby's parents had given Bobby the sound equipment and camera as a graduation present. We spent the summer figuring out what we were going to film when we came across the urban legend of the Wendigo of Fort Kent. Since then, we have been obsessed about the film. After we had gotten the essentials needed for our trip to the ghost town, we headed for the fort. January 12th, 2018, Day 1. We arrived in Fort Kent around 2 p.m. It took us 4 hours to set up all the tents and gear. We decided to set up near the outskirts of town. For some reason, we felt more comfortable here. No one said anything, but everyone got more nervous the further we went into town. By the time we were all set up, the sun had already set, and we couldn't see anything past the glow of the bonfire. We decided to drink the night away, talking about all the things we would do once the morning came. Around 10 p.m., we started to notice snowflakes starting to fall. We huddled around the fire more, but when the wind started picking up as well, we decided to call it a night. We had 2 tents set up, one for me and Mike, and the other one for Kylie and Bobby. Mike and I lay on top of a blow-up queen-sized mattress that had 3 heavy covers on top of it. The 2 of us got under the blankets and looked up at the ceiling. I could feel Mike trying to get into my pants, but I shrugged him off. This place was giving me a bad vibe, and I wasn't in the mood. The The walls of the 8-person tent shook as the wind and snow pummeled against the tent, making it difficult to hear anything. At the time, I didn't think anything of it, but I swore I thought I could hear the howl of a wolf through the sound of the wind. January 13th, 2018, Day 2. I woke up around 6 a.m. this morning to Mike snoring beside me. His arm was draped around me as my eyes slowly opened. The tent was still, and the sound of the wind was silent. I brought my hand up to his arm and pulled it off of me. I rolled off the bed and pulled myself off of the floor. I quickly got dressed. To my surprise, it was warmer inside than I thought it would have been. I put on a parka and toque and opened the flap that led outside. A foot of snow fell into the tent the moment the flap was open. I let out a startled, silent meep and jumped back. I looked behind me, wondering if I had awoken Mike. To my relief, he was still snoring away. I composed myself and pulled myself out of the tent and into the snow. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked outside. I stood at 5'8" and had the snow reach up to my knees, so overnight we had gotten a fair amount of snow. So it took me by complete surprise when I saw a set of footprints traveling through the snow around our tents. I figured that Bobby must have gotten up during the night and had a smoke. So again, I didn't think much of it. I looked towards the town. 2 rundown houses stood about 100 feet away. Then I looked to my right and saw our rental vehicle completely covered in snow. I spent the next 2 hours cleaning off the vehicle of snow. By the time I had finally gotten it cleaned, the rest of my friends had gotten up and started walking around. Bobby had taken out his camera and started to film the area. The last I had seen him, he was heading into town with Kylie while Mike came over to me. We talked a while about the project we were working on. We didn't have any shovels, so getting the SUV out of the area we were in was very difficult. Eventually, after much effort, we got the SUV out and onto the soft snow. The 4-wheel drive made the situation a little better. We both got into the SUV and drove it through the town. We followed the footprints that seemed to go to each house in the town, until finally the footprints went to a house, and there weren't any footprints coming back out. We parked the SUV on the side of the road, got out, and headed to the house the footprints went to. Turns out, the house had looked like someone had been living in it recently. We found them in the basement. Bobby was filming writing, which was covering every square inch of the basement. On one side of the wall, it read, "Beware the Wendigo." As the writing went along the wall, the writing got more and more messy. By the end, the writing became scratches in the wall. Finally, it read, "I am the Wendigo." We did some more shooting, making an introduction to the movie. By the time 4 p.m. came around, we decided to head back to the campground and pack it in for the night. By the time we got back to camp, it was pitch black outside. We parked the SUV beside the tents, and all 4 of us headed inside mine and Mike's tent. We continued to drink and had a cold dinner from soup cans. We played cards until 10 p.m., right until we heard a howl coming right outside of our tent. We had been talking pretty loudly, so we hadn't heard it approach. We could hear the sound of crunching snow under heavy footprints. Then its shadow cast itself on the tent, and the only thing we could see were its legs. Not only was the creature bipedal, but it was huge. Mike was about to open the flap to check what it was, when we heard the sound of metal being torn to pieces. The sound of the car alarm going off as it did. I wanted to scream, but I was too terrified to do so. Soon the sound of metal being torn to shreds stopped and silence ensued. I was about to let out a sigh of relief when I heard another howl. Then the sound of the other tent being torn to shreds could be heard. After another 5 minutes, the sound faded and we could hear the creature walking away from our tents. We waited until midnight to get out of our tent and see the damage. The car and tent were destroyed. We had left most of our food in the car, and from what we could see, there was no food left. Kylie started to cry and Bobby tried to console her, while Mike and I just stood there in shock, wondering what we would do next. Bobby had brought his camera into our tent, but the sound equipment he had been in his tent and was now destroyed as well. We realized that our project was finished, and we would have to go back to Bonneville in the morning. We didn't get much sleep that night, and this was only the tip of the iceberg. Our stay in Fort Kent was only just starting. Second story. My brother killed a sacred deer. Recently, my little brother got into hunting. The woods and camping were never something I ever enjoyed. I was more of an under a pile of blankets with a book kind of guy. I wanted to support him in his new hobby, so I found myself saying I would go with him and his wife on a weekend hunting trip. The day before we left, I felt a small cold coming on. By the time we got out camp set up and went into the woods to start hunting, I had a fever. My face flushed the gray rainy weather, doing nothing to help it. My brother lent me a rifle even though I never used one before. I decided early on I was not going to shoot anything. The head cold was a good excuse to do so. I was against a tree, sniffling, feeling the effects of my fever when my brother shot something. I heard his wife gasp after something big in the distance thudded to the ground. When I looked over at the both of them, I realized something was very wrong. Their faces pale and in shock of what just happened. At first, I was convinced my brother accidentally shot someone. I looked off through the trees trying to see what collapsed. Spotting a white shape through the bush, I started forwards ready to help while the other two remained frozen to the spot. I arrived first to look at what my brother killed. To my relief, it was a deer. Pure white, and I stood in awe of the beautiful coat of fur. I've never seen a white deer before, and a pang of pain came to my chest over the fact it was dead. Finally, my brother and his wife walked over, still pale. "What is that?" he asked in a hushed tone. I looked at him, confused about the question for a few seconds. "It's a deer." How could he not see that? Looking over to studied it again, trying to see what he meant. When my eyes landed on the deer's face, I finally started to understand the gravity of this situation. I know it had antlers, but for the life of me, I can't remember what the face looked like. My memory was a blur of white. While staring right at it, my brain refused to actually see it. I took a few steps back then, scared out of my mind, and started to think my fever was messing up my head. "That doesn't make any sense," I said in a low voice between some coughs. The deer in front of us was special, beyond special, and my brother shot it. I looked at the wound that killed the poor thing to see pearl-shaded blood staining the wounds. My stomach twisted in regret, and I felt like I was about to sob. I turned my head away, unable to keep looking at it. "What should we do?" his wife, Kathy, asked in a shaking voice. "We shouldn't let the meat go to waste," my brother commented. I felt the entire forest fell still at his comment. It was as if the air itself stopped moving. It revolted me. It was terrible enough this creature was dead, and my brother wanted to disrespect it further. It knew it was natural for animals to eat each other, and logically it would be a waste to not eat this deer. However, I just instinctively knew this creature was never meant to be eaten. It was something that existed outside the natural order. Something powerful and yet fragile enough to be killed by a single bullet. "Are you crazy?" I hissed at him. Looking down at the white shape, I shook my feverish head. "We'll let the forest take it." He reluctantly agreed. I put down the borrowed rifle and started to pick up fallen branches. My brother doing the same. Kathy gathered up wildflowers, and in a short, while we covered the deer as a sign of respect. We could never take back killing it, but we could show remorse. Without a word, we left the creature behind and with a heavy weight in our chests. When we arrived back into camp, I was feeling so ill-turned in the moment we got back. I bundled myself up in blankets and fell into a deep sleep, only waking to drink some water to ease my dry throat. My slight cold turned into a full-blown flu, and I was in no condition to walk out of the woods. When I woke again, it was morning but still gray and cold. "How are you doing?" Kathy asked me when I came out of my tent. "Awful. What's the plan?" I felt like my head was going to explode and my entire body was weak. She walked over and gave me a cup of hot tea, which was very much appreciated. "We'll stick around until you feel better and the weather clears up. We should get you out of these woods, but it would nearly kill you if you walked through the rain to get to the truck. Just stay inside your tent and keep warm and dry. You brought some books, right?" I nodded, sipping at my tea. That sounded like a good enough plan. I hoped my fever would only last another day and we could leave. What happened the day before really was freaking me out. The forest around us felt hostile. The wind howled through the trees and I suppressed a shudder. I took my tea back inside the tent and got wrapped up in blankets once more, but not feeling any warmer. The wind kept howling outside the tent. I prayed my flimsy tent would hold if a storm came rolling in. The rest of the day, I drifted between trying to read and sleeping. I normally never got sick, so it was hitting me extra hard. When Kathy tried waking me to eat some soup, I was in such a deep sleep I didn't even stir, so she left me alone to offer it later. The next day I was feeling much better and starving from not eating much the past 2 days. I had my backpack in my tent, so I opened it to find the hidden snacks I stashed away. I ate an entire box of oatmeal bars before getting outside my tent. When I went outside, the rain cleared up, but everything was still damp outside. Kathy was outside trying to keep the fire going. "Are you feeling any better?" she asked me, looking and sounding exhausted. "A bit. I think we could leave sometime today if it doesn't start raining again," I offered. She looked between me and her tent, worried. Clearing her throat, she shook her head. "James isn't feeling well. I think he caught your cold. Let's see how he is in a few hours." I felt bad that my brother was sick and now suffering through what I just did. It would delay us leaving, but there was nothing I could do about it. I saw that we were out of firewood and I needed to get some air. "I'll get us some wood. It'll give me something to do. I'll check on him in a few hours. Make sure he's eating." Kathy gave me a grateful smile. From how bad she looked, I wondered if she'd gotten sick too. I left into the woods, trying my best to find anything that wasn't too damp to burn. I found some sticks hidden under leaves and logs that should be dry enough. I was the type to get lost easy, so I needed to stick around the camp. After I collected an armful of good enough wood, I was about ready to head back when something out of the corner of my eyes made me stop. On a bush was a few drips of shimmering liquid. I walked up to it to get a better look, not understanding what I was looking at. I was drawn away by the sound of retching off towards the camp. Forgetting about the strange liquid, I started back to check up on my brother and Kathy. When I arrived back, the rain started again, making it too wet for us to start the fire back up. Kathy was looking pale and chilled down to the bone. I wished the cold, damp weather would pass so we could finally leave. I started to wonder if I should just take my brother's truck and get some help. My fever hadn't gone down entirely, and we parked so far away. I feared I would get too ill if I braved the hike through the woods. "Is everything all right?" I asked. I put the wood away, covering it with plastic, hoping for it to stay dry. Kathy looked at me, a worried expression on her face. Before she could answer, my brother came out of his tent. It should have been impossible, but he looked paler than Kathy, his skin nearly void of any color. I decided then I would try to get some help. We needed to get the hell out of those woods. "James, give me your keys, please," I said, holding out my hand for him to give me his truck keys from his pocket. He looked over at me, as if I was speaking a different language. Shaking his head, he took a sip of water from a flask Kathy handed to him. She looked scared stiff. James felt different. It was the way he was moving and not really looking at us.
No.
Just give me another few hours to sleep. Then we'll all go. I never should have given in. I slowly brought my hand back, trying to think of an argument. Truthfully, I was frightened to go into the woods alone. Just a few more hours. Then we wouldn't even pack up our gear. We would just leave. James took Kathy's hand, and they went back into their tent. Not being able to think of anything else to do, I went back into mine to get dry and warm. I was going to finish the last 100 pages of a book to give my brother time to sleep. I drifted off while I was reading. One moment I had a book in my hand, and the other I was waking up in a pitch darkness. I sat up, confused at what time it was. Slowly my eyes adjusted and I could see a hint of light coming through the tent. Slipping back into the cold, damp outside world, I looked over to see a very weak fire burning. My brother stood just within the light. I opened my mouth to call out to him, but something felt wrong. I couldn't place it. The air was tense and my muscles started to lock up. Hearing me coming from my tent, my brother turned to look over at me. He still looked pale as death. His face was the same, but I just knew in that moment I was no longer looking at my brother. He took a step towards me, an unknown purpose in his stride. I ran, without any plan. I ran off into the woods trying to get away from whatever he become. I was only running for a few minutes when I saw the light of a fire between the trees. It was faint, but I ran towards it praying someone would help. I didn't think anyone was camping so close to us and was thankful for it. I ran into the clearing, but my blood froze in my veins. It was not a new campsite. It was ours. I just ran back around, even though I was positive I ran straight. My brother stood by the dying coals, the orange light shining in his eyes. I ran again. It was dark and the woods was just a maze of trees. It was understandable I got turned around. A few more minutes of running and I came crashing into our campsite again. In a blind panic, I just kept going. No matter what direction I took, I would always end up running towards our camp. My brother standing, silently watching me attempting and failing to escape. When I couldn't run anymore, I collapsed gasping for air. I didn't understand what was going on. All I knew was I could no longer leave. Please, I begged the pale figure. It was far too late to save my brother, but if there was even a hint of him left, he would let me and Kathy leave. His face was going out of focus. For whatever reason, my brain was refusing to see what it truly looked like. Let me and Kathy leave. I sat on the cold ground, shaking in fear. Deep down, I knew my brother wasn't changing into something beyond my understanding simply because he shot a strange deer. My suspicions I could not bear to say out loud was confirmed by him when he finally spoke in a rasping voice. I cannot let her go. After all, she ate some of it too. My stomach sank, and I felt like I was going to be sick. Killing the white deer by accident could be forgiven, but cutting into its body to devour the flesh could not. The thing that was once my brother lunged at me. He grabbed me by the neck as I struggled, desperate to get free. I got as far as the dying fire pit before he held me still. His strength was far beyond my own. I kicked and screamed, trying to pry him away from me. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I saw his mouth. Oh God, whatever he became was something no human should ever see. It opened wide with countless teeth shining in the dying firelight. He had turned into something so twisted because of his unforgivable sin. I was only saved because I thought. For a brief moment, I saw a white figure behind my brother urging me to fight. I had nothing to lose, so I reached over to the nearby coals. The fear causing me to ignore the pain of grabbing coals and ash to toss into the creature's eyes. He let out a scream of pain and let me go. I wasted no time scrambling free, but paused at the edge of the camp. I watched in horrified fascination as the thing that was once my brother screamed and thrashed around. Sickening cracking sound came from his body as he started to turn from a human form into something completely different, twisted with long pale limbs. I couldn't stomach the sight. I almost couldn't stand the idea of leaving Kathy behind. She was either already dead or turning into something else inside the tent and out of sight. I felt trapped. I knew if I left I would end back up in the camp again. Off in the distance, I saw a hint of white through the trees, and I ran towards it. As I ran, I heard the monster I left behind screaming at me to stay. This time, instead of looping back around, I noticed a hint of a shimmering liquid on the ground and I followed it. Drop by drop, I kept going until my lungs felt like they were going to burst and my legs burned. The forest around me started to get lighter until I found myself running right into a snow-covered parking lot. I collapsed again, feeling weak and the snow soaked through my jeans. It wasn't the season for snow. The parking lot was right next to the ranger station. When I came running out exhausted, a ranger saw me and came outside to see what was going on. I couldn't keep myself awake until he got to me and passed out in the slush. In the end, they never found James and Kathy. They found our abandoned campsite months ago and assumed us all dead. I could never tell them what really happened because I don't know myself. I don't feel as if this was all a dream, or if my mind just snapped. I'm certain my brother is now something else out there inside the woods. I wonder why I was saved. What creature decided to show me the right way out? Was it the white deer because I didn't eat part of it? Or did it want me to live so I could tell others about what happened? Whatever reason it might be, I'm thankful for my life. If you're ever out hunting, make certain you know what you're about to shoot before you pull the trigger, or else you might make a mistake that is going to change your life forever. Third story, Wendigo. It all began almost a year ago when I went through my girlfriend's computer after she began acting odd. Initially, I thought she was cheating on me, but what I found, it was worse. It's been months since we finally put that hell behind us, but I still feel uneasy at night. Almost 1 year ago, my girlfriend was kidnapped, and the police had no luck with the case. I moved in with my 2 friends, Reagan and Jim. My girlfriend began sending me weird texts, and we all got scared. One night, Reagan and Jim went to the movies and didn't come back. A week after their disappearance, Reagan showed up at the house, bloodied and naked. She told me about how she and Jim were drugged. She told me how she was kept in a basement and how she was raped. She told me she saw another girl in that basement. I knew it. I knew it was Victoria. 2 days after Reagan got home, we set off to find this house of horror. After she told me everything that happened to her, she told me she knew where she was being kept. I have one distinct memory while being transported. A stop sign. It had a cross street on it. I read it. Whitney Ranch and Patrick Lane. She paused for a moment before continuing. The basement wall was all brick. All the houses around here are made of stucco. I bet it sticks out like a sore thumb. I was skeptical. A kidnapper wants to blend in. Whatever the fuck this thing, or this guy, is, he's not holed up in some brick mansion. Why the fuck not? She asked. How many weird-ass houses do you see every day you drive? Do you barge in there demanding to know if there are any prisoners in the basement? Shit. Let's go there and fuck this guy up. Right? You're probably thinking that we should just call the police. The thing is, the last time I called the police, I found a severed finger in my house. The next time I called the police, Reagan and Jim were kidnapped. When I called the police again, Reagan was delivered to my doorstep in an absolutely disgusting condition, on the verge of death. Well, Before we had our talk, we found something else in the house. A whole hand and a note. More police begets more limbs. So we went to Patrick and Whitney. We saw no mysterious brick house. We searched the surrounding neighborhood every day that week. Finally, we found it. A house made of brick, just like Reagan said. It was small, 1 story tall. It was unkempt, but that's not saying much in this neighborhood. Aside from the building material, the house looked like any other house on the block. Reagan looked nervous, and I sure as hell didn't want to be here. So I told her, "You know we can still go back, right? He has Jim, Alex." Fuck. That may have been Jim's hand. That girl with me in there, that could have been Victoria. She was right. Do we knock? I asked. Fuck no. We wait. Our car was parked on the other side of the road adjacent to the house. We waited and waited. Reagan assured me that the kidnapper, a man who called himself Wendigo, left the home at least once a day. We watched the place in shifts during nightfall. Finally, around 4 a.m., the front door opened. I shook Reagan awake. Someone walked out of the house. A tall man. The guy had to be at the very least 7 feet tall. He was skinny, and he was wearing a tuxedo. It was ripped and ragged. Holy shit, I said. He's just like you described. He's even wearing that weird fucking sack on his head. He locked his door and looked around. We ducked under the windows. Slowly I crept up. He was gone. He'd leave for hours at a time. So now is our chance, Reagan said. I was about to unlock the door when something hit the car with a loud thud. Shit, I screamed. My windshield was cracked, and it took a second to process what had hit it. It was a fucking human head, horribly disfigured, pieces of it missing. I turned on the car and was ready to gun it when I heard glass break and Reagan scream. She was being pulled out of the passenger window. Just drive, damn it. Fuck. She kept screaming at me to gun it, but I knew if I drove right now she would either be pulled out or have her back broken. I opened my door and circled around the car. We had no weapons on us, since our plan was to sneak in and call the police from the inside after finding Victoria and Jim. I was about to tackle the guy, but I just fucking stood there. This was no normal fucking guy. His hands were blood-soaked, his nails long and sharp. His movements were erratic and jerky. He pulled Reagan out of the window and tossed her at a nearby wall. She blacked out. "What the fuck are you?" I asked. At least I think I asked. I don't remember if I spoke at all. I was so terrified. "I do not want her. She is filthy," he said. His voice was raspy and low. He stretched out random syllables and would stumble mid-word as well. "I want clean ones only." I fucking turned around and ran, straight into his house. I heard his footsteps behind me, erratic as hell. Thud, 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 thud. I turned my head to see how far away he was. I had a few seconds on him, which normally would have comforted me, but the way he ran, his legs were spread wide and he took gigantic fucking steps, almost like leaps, and flailed his arms. It would almost be goofy if it weren't for that inhuman speed. My lead was quickly disappearing. Then I remembered he locked his door. Well, shit. And here comes this fucking psychopath running at me at full speed. So I turned around and stood there like an idiot. Right before he tackled me, I dove out of the way. He hit the door and fell to the ground. I started kicking him and he was screaming. I saw a metal rod nearby, grabbed it, and smashed him over the face. He stopped moving. I should have decapitated the piece of shit, but Victoria and Jim could have been dying that very moment. I decided to call the police. I found his keys and opened the door. I immediately took out my phone to dial the cops. No reception, typical fucking Sprint. I frantically walked around the place looking for the basement door, checking my phone the whole time. I opened a few doors and found nothing. His house was eerily normal. Finally, 2 bars. I dialed 911 and simultaneously opened a door. Holy fucking shit. I stepped inside before I realized where I was. The smell was putrid, and it was terrifyingly cold. It was a fucking walk-in refrigerator. No shelves, no storage, just an empty and cold room with vents. And a floor covered in meat. Human meat. In some corners it looked like steaks, chopped up with intent. The rest of the place was just blood, body parts, and entrails. It was too late for my shoes. I stepped into what was literally an inch-high pool of coagulated blood. If it weren't for the adrenaline, I would have vomited. I closed the door and got the fuck out of there. I needed to find that basement. I looked at my phone. Call dropped. Fuck. I tried dialing again, but it wouldn't go through. Luckily, I found the basement. I ran down it and turned on the lights. The smell was putrid here as well, but it wasn't rotting meat. It was shit. Literally the smell of piss and shit. On one end of the room, I saw a bed with chains on it, bolted to the floor. Reagan's bed. I looked at the opposite end. It was Victoria. She was completely naked, covered in God knows what, rocking back and forth with her eyes wide open, staring at the wall. She was so skinny. She literally looked like a skeleton. Holy fuck. Babe, Vic, it's me. I'm here and I'll get you out of here. She kept rocking back and forth, slowly, in perfect rhythm. She was staring at a clock on the wall. It was broken, with the second hand repeatedly going back and forth by one interval. Let's go. I screamed. Suddenly, she stopped moving and turned slowly towards me, her eyes still wide. She wasn't blinking. She stared right at me. No, it looked like she was staring through me. Her jaw opened, far beyond the point where it should have. I heard bones cracking, and she bared her teeth. I didn't have time for this shit. I ran to get her. I tripped, and I blacked out. I wish I could say this story had a hero's ending, but it didn't. I was lucky, very lucky. The police traced the call, I guess, and got to me. We all woke up in the hospital. They didn't find this Wendigo psychopath, but they're searching for him. They didn't find Jim either. A horrifying thought went through my mind, and I asked them about that meat fridge. They said it would take them months to run all that DNA, and most of it would be unreliable due to the cross-contamination. Reagan and I were fine, but Victoria was in poor shape. We visited her at the hospital every day for months since then. The police department stationed an officer by her door during the night, for her safety. I thought that was great of them. The guy was real nice, too. Kept her company and genuinely seemed to care about her condition. I wondered if he would be able to protect her if that psychopath showed up again. He was tall as hell and had a gun. I couldn't complain, I guess. I've tried talking about the case with the cop before, but every time he would tell me there was nothing he could tell me. For some reason, I trusted him. Heck, I still do. I had so many unanswered questions about everything, but every time I'd think about asking one, I felt as though I didn't need to. To be honest, I kind of stopped caring about all this anyway. I've moved on, you could say. So much so, I'm not even going to bother to proofread this post. Usually I'd comb through it several times to make sure I didn't make any glaring errors, but I'm just so tired. I need rest. Victoria is still in the hospital, and her condition doesn't seem to be improving that much, but there is always hope. Reagan and I will be waiting for her when she's better. Fourth story. There's something wrong with the woods near my house. Trigger warning. Child death. My family and I recently moved away from the city, settling in a gorgeous house in the middle of a developing neighborhood. Our house was one of the first to be built in the area, so aside from a couple of other houses, there wasn't many people around yet. Instead, we were surrounded by a vast ocean of trees and greenery, untouched by the hand of man. I first noticed it when I left my house one morning to go on a run. I suffered from depression, an invisible illness that my parents never took seriously until they found me in the hospital drunk and disoriented. I tried to throw myself in the middle of the busy road, ranting about wanting to end it all. Luckily for me, my friends were able to wrestle me down and someone called an ambulance. That's one of the main reasons we moved so far away from the city, so we could spend more time as a family recovering. I was always restless, so I would often wake up at dusk and go on a jog to sort out my thoughts. I grabbed my earbuds and a windbreaker and quietly entered in the security pin for the alarm system and headed out. The air was cool and crispy, full of microscopic drops of last night's storms. Although it was the middle of summer, it felt more like fall. I started off with a light jog, running down the street full of half-finished houses and out into the trees. The closest thing to nature I ever got was Central Park, back when we lived in the city. Unlike Central Park, however, there was no pavement full of cyclists or random tourists taking pictures everywhere. It was just me and the sounds of crickets, swaying trees, and the cacophony of birds. Eventually I got tired and decided to stop near a fallen tree. I leaned back against the log and sat down, taking a sip from my water bottle. I looked around a little before putting on my earbuds. As nice as nature was, my thoughts and memories were overpowering the scenery. All I kept thinking about was the day our life turned to hell. It was barely a year since the incident, but I could still remember it like it was yesterday. My parents had to go out to work like always, and I stayed home to take care of my little brother Diego. I was in charge of watching him ever since I was little. I would wake him up, feed him, bathe him, and help him with his homework. I would drop him off on my way to school and pick him up. One morning, I woke up to find him still on the kitchen floor surrounded by a mess of flour and other ingredients. He had tried to make some breakfast and choked on a slice of banana. He choked because I didn't wake up on time. His death was on me. Now my baby brother was gone. I was so deep in my thoughts that I didn't notice the music had stopped in my earbuds, instead being replaced by faint static. "Sissy, leave." A very faint and familiar voice had whispered through the static. It almost sounded like Diego's voice. I tried to raise the volume on my phone, but when I pulled my phone out, it shut off. I tried to turn it back on, but it only displayed the message of low battery. Weird. I always charge my phone overnight. I took off my earbuds and put them back in their case when I heard a branch snap to my right. I looked over and saw a little boy wearing a Bob the Builder PJs. It was Diego? No, it couldn't be. I had to be dreaming. His big, innocent brown eyes stared up at me, and with his finger, he motioned me to follow him. I wanted to follow him, but something wasn't right about this entire situation. The area had gone completely silent. The birds and even the insects had left. There wasn't even wind. The hairs in the back of my neck had started to stand up and my heart was pounding faster. I looked away from his direction and ran towards home. As I ran, I looked back and saw that the area was empty. I made it home out of breath, but I didn't care as long as I was away from that place. I spent the rest of the day distracting myself until my parents came home from work. When they did, I didn't mention anything out of the ordinary. I didn't need to give them another reason to diminish their perspective of me. I laid in bed that night, thinking about what I saw. I probably dreamt it all. I was tired. It was probably grief. I kept thinking about ways to rationalize what I saw, but I knew deep down that what I saw was real. The next morning, I went downstairs into the kitchen where my parents were sitting down making breakfast. "So, How are you settling in? My father asked while scraping his fork around the scrambled eggs on his plate. We have another month before school starts. Your father and I were wondering if you wanted to go camping, my mother said awkwardly while stirring the spoon in her cup of coffee. She had a tendency to fidget when she was nervous. Yeah, it would be nice to do something as a family before you start school. Plus, we could explore this area a bit, my father reiterated. If that's okay with you? My mother raising an eyebrow while taking a sip of her coffee. I merely nodded while sitting down to pick at the eggs in front of me. For a brief second, I remembered about yesterday's events, but I was disrupted by my parents' awkward conversation. I think we should go this weekend. I checked the forecast, and the weather should be perfect this weekend. I hear there's a campsite close by. My mother continued on while my father continued picking at his eggs. In that case, I think we should start packing and gathering camping stuff. I think I'm going to run into town for a quick bit later today and get the rest of the supplies. Okowo. My mother nodded, agreeing with my father. The rest of the day went by smoothly with my parents gone. I spent all day just lying in bed and going on social media. The clock app made it super easy for me to distract myself from the complete silence of the house. When Diego was around, there was never any silence. He would always blast the TV or play really loud music. Now there's too much. I eventually drifted off to sleep. The next 2 days were the same as the previous days. I just laid in bed browsing more social media, trying to distract myself from my own brain. Eventually, Friday arrived, and we soon found ourselves on the road on our way to the campsite my parents talked about. The drive there wasn't that long, but it felt like an eternity with the utter silence. If this was the way it was going to be, I was already counting down the seconds. The actual campsite was nothing special. It was a flat area with several wooden tables and empty fire pits, but the area surrounding it was covered in a light mist that made it a little eerie due to the trees limiting our vision outside of the campground. Why is it so misty? My mother asked with worry on her face. Do you think it's going to rain? My father shook his head while gently parking across the site. Nah, the forecast didn't show any signs of rain. It's probably the mist coming up from the lake nearby since it's early morning. How far away are we from home? I asked, looking around at the trees. The trees looked much different than the ones that surrounded our house. These were taller and looked like pine trees. We're not that far from home. Maybe 30 minutes away? Why? My father asked while putting his phone away. The trees are different. Oh, I didn't notice. My mother replied. All right, come help me get out the supplies and set up the tent. Hey, where is everyone? My mother asked. What do you mean? It's completely empty. You'd think there would be people around. Who knows, maybe a lot of people don't camp around here. Regardless, we're here now, so we should set up the tent, my father stated, his tone turning serious. All right. My mother motioned me to help her move the poles around while she took out the plastic flaps of the tent. It took us a bit, but we managed to set up the tent while my father set up a fire on one of the camp grills. He started to grill some meats when my mother interrupted him. Wait, aren't there bears or something? I think I read somewhere that we shouldn't have food on us. Or maybe we should set up the tent far away from the area. Beats me. There's a reason the campgrounds have these set up. I don't think it's bears we have to watch out for. My father scoffed. Okay, but what about all the other animals? My mother asked, much to my annoyance. She just had to keep asking questions. But she was kind of right. Well, the meat is already cooked, so let's eat lunch and move on. My father could never back down even if he knew he was in the wrong. We ate on one of the picnic tables, under the now blazing sun. The area was pretty empty, but the scenery was gorgeous. The trees were massive, but yet we could still see the peaks of the mountains in the far distance. It's so pretty here. I think we should go on a hike. My mother insisted, snapping me back to reality. We finished up pretty quick and gathered some bottles of water and began to follow one of the trails nearby. My father kept talking about the scenery while my mother just asked random questions here and there. I know they tried to maintain some semblance of normality, but honestly, it kind of irked me that they tried to act like nothing was wrong. I felt like my anger was festering and bottling up, and I wanted to yell and scream at them, but that thought was quickly forgotten when we heard rustling to our left. "You think that's a deer?" my mother asked. "I'm not Sue Dash." My father's words were cut off quickly by the figure in Bob the Builder PJs that approached us. It was Diego once again, except this time he stopped for a bit before running across the path in front of us and darting back into the woods. We stood in complete silence before I spoke up. "Diego?" I asked, my vision becoming blurry with the tears that were forming in my eyes. "No, that wasn't him," my mother snapped. "That was someone else's kid. He's probably lost or something." My father shook his head and looked around.
No, Schande.
"That was definitely our son. It can't be," my mother insisted. Before we could utter another word, a large gust of wind blew on us, causing all the trees to sway back and forth. But it wasn't the sound of the trees that sent a chill down our core, but the cries of several people all around us. I tried looking around, but I couldn't see anyone. It was getting louder and louder to the point that it was getting hard to hear my parents. "What the fuck is going on?" my mother cried out, the wind whipping her hair around. "We have to leave." My father grabbed my mother's hand and tried running towards the path back. I ran after them, and we kept running until we no longer heard the crying wails. "What the fuck just happened?" I cried out. "I don't know, but we have to go back. Fuck this place." My father cursed as we walked. My mother was completely silent. We must have walked for at least an hour before I spoke up. "Why do I feel like we walked further than we should have?" "Yeah, I noticed that too. Are we even on the right path?" I asked. "Kristen, don't be an idiot. The path was straight. How the fuck could we get lost?" My father snapped at me. "Jesus, I was just trying to help. If you want to help, use your phone to see where we are." I quietly took my phone out and tried to open the map up, but it kept saying there was no location available. "It won't let me," I said meekly, trying to avoid another one of his fits. "Give it to me." "Useless," he bickered. He grabbed it out of my hands and played around with it before throwing it back to me. "Fuck here. Keep trying. Let's just keep walking." We walked another couple of hours before we could no longer see anything as the sun was starting to set completely. It got dark pretty fast. Too fast. Pretty soon, it was pitch black. I was about to ask another question, but decided to keep my mouth shut because I was scared of getting yelled at. All of a sudden, the wails started up again, but in the trail in front of us, we saw a bunch of hooded figures walking towards us. "Hey, what the fuck do you want? Who are you people?" my father yelled at them. I looked at my mother, who was in complete shock as she cowered behind him. As they got closer, I could see that there was something off about them. They were taller than the average person, and they walked gracefully. Their heads didn't bop up and down like a person when they walked. I looked down and saw they were almost gliding over the ground. They were fucking floating. I felt my body tense up, but I motioned at my father to look down, and he bolted into the woods, dragging my mother along with him. I tried to keep up with them, looking back every so often to see that they stood still, just watching us run. There was something so wrong about them. I looked in front of me, but I could no longer see my parents.
Ma. Pa.
I yelled out. "I can't see you guys. Please wait." I began to hyperventilate, and I took out my phone and activated the flashlight, but it was so dark that the light barely helped. I walked and soon found myself in front of a wreck of a rusted car. The windows were long busted, but the doors were still closed. I quietly opened one and crawled inside. I cried in complete silence, telling myself that I would just have to wait until morning to begin to walk back to the campground. I just have to hang on until morning. I tried calling the police, but my phone won't let phone calls go through. My phone is acting pretty strange, only letting me use certain apps like this one. I'm not sure where I am, to be honest. I just have to wait for a couple of more hours until the sun sets up. Fifth story. I saw the Wendigo when I was 12. I was about 12 years old when I saw a creature I never expected to be biologically possible. Before I start recalling this horrifying memory, I have to explain what I think I saw by telling a description of something really similar to it. The Wendigo is a creature from Native American folklore, usually resembling either a human with pointed teeth and dried blood covering its body, or a humanoid animal-like spirit with a deer skull-like head. It feeds on humans, due to it being a cannibal spirit. In 1659, there were reports of a humanoid creature with a skull-like head killing some of the people who originally founded America in the city of what is now New York. It eventually left, and what remained was an absolute bloodbath. The town I live in refuses to talk about this occurrence, and most have forgotten about it. But not me. Anyway, I'll get on with the story. I was walking home with my parents after a long day at the zoo. It was midwinter, so there was heavy snow all over the ground. I saw large footprints in the snow, shaped like those of a large bird. The only difference was the left toe was lifted off of the ground. I pointed this out to my parents, but they said it was probably just someone in a dinosaur costume having a prank. A snowstorm broke out 20 minutes after we set out, and I said to my parents, "We should be moving. This could be dangerous." My parents agreed, and we took shelter in a subway. My dad eventually went out to see if it was safe. We heard a low, reptilian growl, then the sound of bones snapping. We ran further down the subway, got into the train, and jumped out at the next station, which was very near our house. We shut the door, locked it, and I went straight into my bedroom. I shut the door, and just in case I closed the blinds and barricaded the door. Only something supernaturally strong could push that, right? I was terribly wrong when I thought that. I heard the front door smashing open and my mother screaming. Whatever just attacked my mom pushed my door open with ease. I then realized I had made a stupid mistake. I had only used light objects to barricade the door. The creature in front of me had armor on its head, resembling a deer skull, with a crack on its snout. Its yellow eyes with slit pupils stared at me, and I stared back. Its fur was stained with blood, and I saw it holding an arm I recognized as my own father's. The creature's gray figure began to move towards me. Without thinking, I grabbed a box and threw it at the creature. It fell backwards, and I realized I had the upper hand. I took the curtain rail off the wall and charged at the creature. I kicked a box onto its head, disorientating it temporarily. When it regained full control of its body, I had already thrust the rail into its underbelly. The creature growled in anger, but eventually went into what appeared to be a permanent state of unconsciousness. I ran downstairs to check my mom. I was relieved when she turned out to be okay. We both went upstairs to check the creature, but it had vanished. Thanks a lot for watching till the end. Subscribe.